Plus. Hazop Plus is a tool that allows you to log the proceedings of your Hazop meetings and then produce Hazop reports, which you can then print or send away as part of email message alerts. When you start Hazop up, this is the dialog that you will see. Here you can select to start a new project. You can open an existing project. There is even a project wizard, which will take you through the process of setting up the basics for your Hazop analysis. You can also create templates. Templates will be basically files that include some of the basic information you need to get started with your Hazop. Things like parameters and guide words, any commonly used risk ranking matrices. Basically, it will give you a foundation on which to build your Hazop, so you don't have to keep adding these basic pieces of information every time you start a new Hazop project. What I'm going to do is start a new project. So this is the Hazop interface. On the left-hand side, we have the buttons that give you access to sheets, or we call them sheets. Basically, these are where you can look at different properties of your Hazop. Now, the first of these sheets is the setup sheet. Here, you can put in some of the basic settings for your Hazop project. These include things like custom fields, whether or not you want to use deviations or parameters and guide words, things like that. So for example, if I go to the deviations option here, I can choose how I want to express the deviations as basically just a deviation description, text that describes the problem that I'm analyzing, or parameters and guide words, which is perhaps more common for a conventional Hazop. Now, the custom fields allows you to add additional fields to each sheet of the Hazop. So for example, let's say we were looking at the summary. The summary sheet lets you enter just basic descriptive information about your Hazop. So these are all just text fields, but maybe you want to add an additional field, maybe a start date or something like that. So I can go back to setup, go to summary, select one of the 20 custom fields that I can add, make it visible. I'll call it start date. And I can choose the type of field I want to make. And it could be a basic line of text. It could be a drop-down box where I actually define the list of options I can choose from that menu. I'm going to choose the date type field. So now that's been created, and if I go to summary, now I've got a start date field. I can choose a date from the standard calendar interface. So the second tab is the messaging tab. I mentioned briefly a moment ago that you can send email alerts to people from Hazop. So you can use this sheet to connect your Hazop tool to your email exchange and set up notifications. So you can basically send reports and messages to people. So for example, if a certain colleague has had a task allocated to them, you can send them a notification with the task sheet attached to it. So you can do that through action notifications, through report notifications. So you just attach to an email exchange, and you can set up these kind of automated messages through the messaging sheet. Now back on the summary tab, you'll notice at the top there are these two fields that say company and Hazop manager. These are what we call personnel fields, and you can choose companies and Hazop managers that have been companies and people rather that have been defined in the personnel sheet. So if we switch to personnel, I can create a company, I can add information about that company, and then to that company I can add people. So I might just add myself. So I can have a list of companies, and each company could have a list of people associated with it. So every time I find a personnel field like this one, I can select a company, or I could select a person, and they will be added to that field. I don't know if you saw earlier, but if you are defining custom fields, one of the custom field types you can create is a personnel field. So you can have additional people here. So if I wanted to say, add to that, I might want to put the secretary or something like that. And that might be a personnel field. And if I go to summary again, now I can select the secretary and add them there too. So we've looked at the personnel field, and now I can go to sessions. The sessions tab allows you to define your Hazop sessions. So every time you and your colleagues sit down for a new Hazop meeting, you would create a new session in the software in which you would log any new studies or actions that you define. So I'm going to add a session. I will call that session, say 01. I can specify the date and time when it started. I can select the company that was the host, select the chairman, secretary, and again, all of this is customizable, so you can add more columns here too. I can also add participants. So I can just add a list of participants who aren't necessarily the secretary or the chairman, but are maybe just present for the meeting. So I can check the box and add them to the list. So I can have multiple sessions, of course. So each session represents one of the meetings that's taken place. On the Drawings tab, you can include images linked to the system that you're analyzing. You might want to add, say, a schematic, or you might want to add a photograph or something like that. So you could add a drawing. I might call that schematic 01. And then I can just go and find the drawing file that I want to attach to. So maybe I don't like that one so much. I can just briefly go find something else. Maybe we'll use that one. So there I've got a schematic that is associated with my system. I could add more images there if I wanted to. Then I can have all kinds of things, photographs, schematics, anything that's associated with my system and I think would be useful for me to be able to see. On the Deviations tab, I can define the problems that I want to look at during my Hazop, and I can do that, as I've mentioned, with a description of the deviation or with simple parameters and guide words. Now these can be created manually. As you can see, you can add parameters and guide words, but we do provide a library with the standard parameters and guide words already in it. At the bottom, you can select the standard option, and then you can see the parameters and the guide words that are available. So I'll select all the parameters and add them, and all the guide words and add them as well. There are my parameters, there are my guide words, and beneath each parameter is a list of the relevant guide words. Now naturally, not every guide word will be relevant to every parameter. So for example, if I select temperature, I can turn off any parameters, any guide words I think are not relevant. So reverse doesn't really make any sense, or part of, but maybe lower temperature, that makes sense, and higher temperature. So they may be two problems that I would face with regards to temperature in my system. So I could do that for each of the parameters, each of the guide words under each parameter. The Nodes tab allows me to build a hierarchy of nodes representing the systems, subsystems, and equipments that I'm going to be analyzing during my Hazop. So I can add a node, and that might be, my system. I might add a child node underneath it, and that might be a piece of equipment, let's say. And I can attach drawings to each of these things. So I might go to my system level, and I'll attach a drawing. So there's my drawing attached to the node. And for each node, I can select the relevant parameters. So, for example, the equipment, I might go to the Parameters tab and say, well, maybe viscosity isn't important, but vibration is, and temperature is. Maybe not reaction or separation, but maybe pressure is important, maybe flow is important. So I can choose which of these parameters are appropriate for my system and my subsystems. So you can see those there. The program has grayed out any of the inappropriate parameters. So the last thing we would need to do before starting our Hazop studies is to actually set up risk ranking matrices. So this is how we would express the risk that results from combinations of things like likelihood and cost, or likelihood and safety severity. Now we can set up matrices manually and create highly customized matrices that involve existing fields in the software or our custom fields in the software. So your risk ranking matrices are very powerfully customizable, but we do provide a couple of standard matrices as well. So I can go to add a predefined matrix. Maybe I'll add a safety ranking matrix. Click OK. So for this, the program's created a matrix. I can select the two input fields from standard fields like severity and likelihood, or from custom fields, which I can create back in the setup sheet. If I go to values, you can see where I can set up the value for each of these input fields. So I can have remote to frequent for likelihood, and for severity, I can have minor to critical, and I can add more or I can delete them. I can customize this any way I want. Finally, I need to define the output. So if I make a selection of likelihood and severity, what will be the resulting safety ranking? So the possible rankings are defined here. So I've created 4 from unacceptable down to low. Again, I can add and delete as I see fit. And I can also add a color coding just using a regular Microsoft color palette. So I can add a color to each of those rankings, and we'll see those in the matrices in a moment. So once we've set up our input fields and our output fields, we can take a look at the matrix. And for each possible combination, if we were setting up this matrix by hand, we would have to select what the output would be from each combination of input. Of course, here that's already been done for me, because this is just one of the standard matrices. So now that we've got our matrix, we can start with our studies. So naturally, a Hazop study is where we select a piece of equipment, then we select a potential problem that could arise in that equipment, and we look at what actions we should take in order to mitigate that problem. So I might say, go into my system and take a look at the equipment. You can see here the drawings that I can select, so I can see any drawings associated with the nodes in this view as well. I'm going to look at my equipment, and you can see under equipment, only the relevant parameters are visible. All the ones I turned off are gone. And if I look at temperature, I can only see the 2 relevant parameters that I selected back on the deviations tab. So let's say we want to know what's the impact of high temperature in our equipment and what are we going to do about it. So I'll select higher, and now in the grid I can start to define a study. So I might say, well, how likely is it that we're going to get high temperature in this piece of equipment? So I might say, well, that's something that will happen occasionally. I say, what's the severity of that? Maybe the severity is high. And then based on those two selections, the program allocates a safety ranking of high coming from that matrix, if you remember. So now I can define the causes, consequences, and safeguards associated with this problem. So I could add a cause. Click Add, and then in that field I can just enter the name of a cause, or I can select a pre-existing cause. What we'll see is, if we go to the analysis sheet, it's possible to define a list of causes, consequences, and safeguards that we can reference when we're building our studies. But if we don't have any, we can just create them manually. So I'll just click cause 1 and close, and that gets added. Now, if I switch briefly to the analysis sheet, we'll see on the causes tab, there's cause 1, and there is the study with which cause 1 is associated. Now, I can add causes through here as well, and they'll be available to me in the study sheet. So I might do that here. I'll create cause 2. If I go back to my study, add, I can add cause 2. I can in fact, I can in fact select and have multiple causes per deviation. Same goes for consequences and safeguards. So I'll just add a couple of those. So I'll have a consequence. Close, and a safeguard. So I can build up a picture of the causes, the consequences, and any safeguards I have in place for that problem. So finally, what we want to do is define an action that we should take in order to prevent or mitigate that problem. So I can go to Actions, double click, add a new action. I can just enter the description of that action, say when it should take place, specify the responsible person, and then give it a priority. So I can click Add. Oops, sorry, I didn't want to do that. So I click Close, and that will add the action. And again, I can have multiple actions per deviation. So I had 2 or 3 actions that need to be taken to prevent this problem. I can put those in. And then I can start defining more studies after that. So I could have multiple studies per parameter and guide word, and so on. So I can start to build up these studies very quickly and easily. So we've looked at the Analysis tab, where we can view our consequences and causes, our safeguards, and the studies associated with them. But we can also go to the Actions tab and see any actions that we've defined as well. And with those actions, we can specify a task. So you might say by temperature sensors, for example, might be a task that needs to take place. I can specify who is responsible for that, when that should be completed, what's the status. But as before, I can add more fields here, have custom fields that allow me to add additional information. So let's take a look then at an example project with a little bit more information in it. So here I have an example project. I'm going to go straight to the studies. Here I can see all the studies currently in this project. I can look through and see the studies associated with each of these nodes. Now, of course, one of the key things that you will want to do when you're producing a Hazop is to produce reports. Hazop reports that show your studies, action sheets that you can pass on to colleagues. So if I'm in the study sheet, I can go to File and to Print Preview, and we have some standard reports you can access here. Now, you can, of course, create your own reports or customize the reports that we provide. But I'll show you some of the standard reports. So maybe study record by session is a nice example. So here the program will list our study records broken down by the sessions and by the nodes and deviations they're associated with. So if I cycle along through the pages, you can see the various different records associated with different deviations and different nodes. These reports can, of course, be printed off. They can also be published in Microsoft Word, PDF, or exported to, say, a text delimited format. Something like CSV, for example, you could actually open in Microsoft Excel. Other examples, if I go to the action sheet and go to File, Print Preview, and maybe Action Sheets, here I get sheets showing the details of the actions to be taken by different people. So I can print those off and get people to date and sign them and give them back once those actions have been completed. So one other thing worth mentioning maybe is that Hazop does include an import facility. So if you have lists of things like consequences or safeguards or things like that in Excel or Access, you can import them into Hazop. So you can go to File, Import, and you can see there it's possible to import from Excel and Access directly. So that is an overview of the Hazop module. As I mentioned, Hazop is relatively simple. It's not an analysis tool. It doesn't do any calculations. It's purely a tool for recording the proceedings of your Hazop studies. So are there any questions about Hazop at all? Again, if you could enter any questions that you have through the chat box. The audio is muted just to reduce background noise. So again, if you could type your questions into the chat box, and I will try to answer those for you. So the Hazop software does not distinguish between software and hardware. So you can do a Hazop at any level. So if you want to do Hazop of your hardware, that's fine. If you want to do Hazop at your software level, that's fine too. So basically, if there's anything missing from the interface that you feel needs to be there for maybe a software Hazop or a hardware Hazop, as I've said, you have lots of custom fields, so you can add those in there as well. So if you wanted a field for operating system or release number or something like that, that would be fine. So you should be able to do the Hazop for any kind of system, whether it's software or hardware. So I don't know if there is an existing template for ISO 26262. I don't think there is currently. I would have to add that we're approaching the release of a new version of Hazop, so it's possible something like that might be getting implemented. But even if not, it would be, I think, a fairly simple thing to actually set up a template yourself. So, for example, you can, as I've mentioned, say, okay, set up a new risk matrix, have that matrix include controllability and severity and all the things that are associated with ISO 26262, and then you yourself could actually save that as a template, and that would then be available for all of your future projects in ISO 26262. So I think currently we don't have a template, but it's actually very, very simple to set one up anyway. And under technical support, if you had a maintenance contract, we could in fact help you to do that anyway if you were finding it a little bit tricky to do. But really, I think it's simple enough that it wouldn't be too hard. Okay, are there any more questions at all? Yes, so the recorded session will be made available as a download link either later today or early next week. But yeah, that will be available to you. Okay, so if there are no more questions for the time being, I'll bring the session to a close. If you do think of any more questions, you can, again, send them to simcad, or if simcad are unable to answer them directly, they can always pass them on to us. But yeah, I will be making the video available hopefully not too long after the session is finished. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining me today, and have a very good evening.